Welcome back to Combat Mission, where I've been spending a lot of time in the editor. Slytherin has run a Choose Your Own Scenario community activity on the official Combat Mission Discord, where the community has voted its way through a series of polls to produce the concepts for 3 battles. The community chose Combat Mission Cold War as the title to base the scenarios in, and generated a meeting engagement in a village, a red attack in a town, and a blue attack in a forest, with all the scenarios emphasising occupy objectives and destroying the enemy. What you're watching in the background is some much accelerated footage of me putting together the first battle. This is a meeting engagement which, in the simplest interpretation possible, can be very straightforward. You have the players on either side, some terrain in the middle for them to fight over, and some objectives to focus their attention. And that's pretty much what I've done here, using the terrain choice of a village to help determine the layout of the map. Villages are not necessarily important objectives armies might fight over in and of themselves, so I started off by putting in a highway going diagonally across the map. Armies are always interested in controlling roads, especially in the kind of high-intensity, fast-paced mechanised warfare of the Cold War era. With the highway slightly offset, I had space underneath to add in some more roads and plot out the general shape of the village itself. I conceptualised this as an old existing settlement around a coaching inn or something like that has expanded into a dormitory village after World War II. That makes for 2 areas that feel very different. I've made the older area smaller and denser, with taller buildings, small yards and cobbled areas. Access is really limited to vehicles because the buildings are very close together, but there are some alleyways for infantry and they can always mousehole forward if they need to. The more modern sections of village, on the other hand, are less dense. While the original centre grew up organically, the newer areas are planned out and organised. So they have longer straight streets, equal-sized houses at regular intervals and similar-sized gardens. It's really all very suburban. The gardens are a major feature of this kind of urban setting, so after plotting them out with hedges, I made sure to go back and mix in a lot of different types of fence and low bocage to make them a lot more visually interesting. They're much more permeable than the old section of the village. Players can plough through the gardens if they really feel the need, but they'll lose speed and probably incur some track damage in the process. So overall, the village forms a wedge in the middle of the map that the players need to think about. There's a lot of cover and concealment in there, but that comes at the cost of restricted mobility and line of sight, and there are 2 key gameplay elements to that. The first is that it presents players with a choice. They can try and get into the village to take advantage of the cover and concealment to hide their forces or to try and fight at closer ranges, or they can keep away to hold onto their speed, manoeuvre options and long fields of fire. Secondly, the village forms a barrier to line of sight. I'm intending to have 1 player start in the north and 1 in the south, and to avoid the battle turning into a first turn shootout, I need something to break up fields of fire and create safe zones for players to deploy their forces in and for any reinforcements to arrive. This is relatively easy in the south with the village. Aside from the buildings themselves, I'm able to add in some tree lines and make some slopes on the flanks to really block off the area I want blue to deploy from. Outside the village, most of the map is made up of open fields, which are obviously a bit more problematic when thinking about disrupting line of sight in the north. The go-to here is to really fall back on the shape of the ground itself and put a slope between Red's deployment zone and the highway. This brings with it other issues to consider, not least making sure that this new hill is high enough to hide Red, but also short enough to make sure Red can't sit on top and shoot over the village into Blue's deployment zone. There are other follow-on effects here too. Red will have to crest the slope and advance down the forward slope to cross the highway and reach the village, which is a very different tactical problem to Blue, whose deployment area naturally leads them into or around the village. So we're getting a bit of asymmetry between the 2 sides developing here. In general, it's harder to hide north of the highway, but there's more freedom of manoeuvre. That doesn't mean things are totally open. I've made sure to add in some tree lines and farms to break things up a bit. Shooting galleries tend not to be that much fun for either side. Thinking about the forces, I originally conceived of this as a US cavalry unit facing off against a Soviet forward security element. It pretty quickly became apparent that the cav was a little too light on infantry and a little too heavy on armour and anti-tank vehicles though, so I swapped them out for a US mechanized infantry company team. The Soviet forward security element stayed in though. This has a similar organisation, but to skew things a little bit more asymmetrically, I went for a pretty high quality Soviet force. They're rolling into this battle with T-64s and BMPs, which outclass the M60A1s and M113s I gave to the Americans. The T-64 is a tough proposition for the earlier American tanks, unless they can hit the lower front slope. The sides are fair game as usual though, so here we've got a bit of a tactical element for both sides to bear in mind. Red wants their tanks facing forward at longer ranges. Blue is going to be better off out wide or up close and personal in complex terrain where they can hit the less well protected angles. The BMP-1P, with its 73mm gun and ATGMs, is a threat to anything that Blue can bring to the table. It can't take a hit, of course, but it can poke holes in Blue's M60s, M150s and M113s. The M113s, meanwhile, are more lightly armed, but still a key enabler for the American infantry, able to rush them about the map and keep them stocked up with ammunition, particularly M72 Laws. This all plays into the asymmetry that began with the terrain. I think it's going to be really interesting to see what players decide to do with these two forces. The Americans are the more infantry heavy of the two, and their infantry has lots of short-ranged anti-tank capability, from Dragon ATGMs to one-shot disposable M72 Laws, so they're probably more suited to holding on to the village. The Soviets have a lot more heavily armed vehicles, so they're probably a bit better out in the open where they can mass all that firepower. To keep things fluid, I split both these forces up, with only a small element starting off on the map, and the rest arriving as reinforcements. So there should be a bit of a recce phase to begin with the red player having a combat reconnaissance patrol, and the blue player having a mechanized infantry platoon, and they can use these to scope out their opponent and come up with a plan of how to commit their backup as the battle escalates. After doing a little testing to get a feel for the map and see where the two forces tended to collide, I ended up putting in two ground objectives. In the northeast, we've got an isolated farm surrounded by lots of open fields, but generally more easily accessible to the Soviets. What's interesting about the farm is that despite being surrounded by open ground and having pretty good fields of fire, it's not necessarily that easy to defend. There's a tall wall around the perimeter that units inside aren't going to be able to see or fire over. So anything holding on to the farm is going to be isolated from the rest of the battle, meaning that players aiming to take and hold it have important decisions to make about what forces they allocate and how to support the attack or defense of the farm from outside the objective. Then in the southwest, we have a junction in the highway. This is sandwiched between the bungalows to the north, just below the farm and orchard on Red's Hill, and the left edge of the village on Blue's side of the map. To make the objective a bit more interesting, I added some berms on both sides of the road, the kind of thing that gets built up to help mitigate traffic noise for the people living right next to it, and these offer some cover for infantry. It's quite a large objective as well, so although the centre is completely open where the highway is, there's cover at the edges, and that means that it's going to be possible for both players to be in a corner at the same time. The tricky tactical problem is working out a way to kick the other guy off the far side, when that means crossing over and increasing exposure to the Soviet hillside or the American village. Both objectives are worth 150 points, which leaves 700 on the table for destroying the enemy. So those ground objectives might be decisive, they're relatively easy points if you can take and hold them, but there's a lot more to be gained by smashing the enemy force, and that's going to require a lot more tactical choice. Some of these tactical choices are pretty standard for meeting engagements. The force density at the very start is going to be very low. There's only going to be 4 vehicles per side for the first 5-10 minutes. So is it best to take that small force and spread it out over the map with no mutual support so you can get a screen up and figure out what your opponent is going to do? Or is it best to concentrate that force all in one place to grab one of the objectives early on? When the main force arrives, should players reinforce what they've already got, mount an attack on enemy positions, or anticipate where their opponent is going to commit their main force and then try and counter? Do you want to plant your flag in those objectives or use them as bait to lure the enemy into ambushes? There's infinite options here. It's not necessarily well balanced. I think the Soviets might have the upper hand, but because this is designed as a tournament scenario, it's essentially going to be fought as a mirror battle, so players will be playing both sides, and any asymmetry between the forces should hopefully balance itself out. With most of the terrain and the forces locked in, the next thing I did was look for rough edges to round off. Just looking for things that didn't quite look right or didn't seem to contribute that much. First amongst these was a big wood block on the left side of the map north of the highway. I put this in originally to help break up line of sight on Red's flank, giving some terrain to exploit, but if anything it was actually more hindrance than help. I'd made the wood block full of pines to make it look like a chunk of artificial commercial logging forest, but combined with the height of the hill, they really looked weirdly tall and out of place. Swapping them out for lower trees helped visually, but the wood block was also presenting some gameplay problems. Its shape, size and location meant that the secondary road passing through it from Red's deployment zone to the junction objective was really awkward, and after having put in a row of bungalows at the base of the hill, along with more trees along the highway, it wasn't really clear exactly what the woodblock was doing, apart from getting in the Soviet player's way. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but for this map it's not really what I wanted. So I got rid of it. I converted the left-hand side to a field of tall grass, and then the right-hand side to an orchard that nicely kind of abuts onto the side of the farm complex up there. Yorkshire trees still limit line of sight a bit, but they're spaced out enough not to really interfere with vehicle movement. In a similar vein, some of the tree lines seemed a little bit thick where they didn't have to be. It's important to break up line of sight, but the map was starting to get a little bit too compartmentalized, and a lot of the lines of sight were starting to get a little bit too short. I still wanted both sides to have some good fields of fire, so without touching the tree lines around the deployment zones, because obviously I want to keep those areas safe, I've also gone around cutting back the trees here and there. This is an exercise in straight up deleting them, or occasionally changing multiple tree tiles to single tree tiles, just generally opening things up. The supermarket at the tip of the village wedge pointing north also got a bit of a redux. That was really kind of a dead area where there was just a big car park with nothing in it, so I've changed it into a little warehouse complex and put some buildings around the edge. Now it looks a little bit more lived in. There's a few gaps in the wall and some extra buildings for players to mess about with so they can get into that compound, maybe take advantage of the second story of the north side of the big warehouse. And with that, we're almost about there. The last thing to tackle is the briefing, which is an exercise in communicating to the player all the important information they're going to need. This is a tournament battle, so it doesn't need the same kind of scene setting or exposition that a campaign or historical scenario needs. So my priority here was keeping things simple and laying out the objectives and the forces available in a way that's really easy to read. And with that, the first mission is ready to go. By which I mean I'm probably going to keep tweaking it right until the last moment. A big shout out to Slytherin for the opportunity to make some tournament scenarios. I'm going to be really looking forward to seeing how everyone tackles it. Whether you win or lose, hopefully this scenario and the others are going to generate some interesting plans, some memorable moments, and most importantly, be a lot of fun to play. I'll catch you in the next video.